Welcome to the 2021 Southwest Liturgical Conference and the ACLS Art and Architecture track. I'm Jim Hundt, current board president of the Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space, or ACLS. ACLS is proud to have created 6 different workshops dedicated to art and architecture for worship exclusively for this year's conference. ACLS is a membership organization dedicated to the creation of worthy spaces for faith communities. Our members are liturgical consultants, artists, architects, and other related professionals. We come from a variety of fields and backgrounds, including the arts, art history, architecture, education, liturgy, and pastoral work. We are passionate about and active in the ministry of church art and architecture. If you are interested in learning more about ACLS or would like to consider becoming a member, visit us at www.liturgical-consultants.org. I hope you enjoy the presentation by our members, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for attending this presentation on looking at your worship space with fresh eyes. I'm Jim Hundt and happy to be presenting this presentation, and I hope you will find it useful. So let's get started. Looking at this first slide, you may think I've got the wrong presentation, but I don't. I wanted to point out that there are reasons why realtors recommend that you don't try to sell your own home. And there's this list of 8 that I found online, and number 7 is because you ignore your home's flaws. And it says that they can see flaws, being the realtors, that you're oblivious to because you see them every day or because you simply don't view them as flaws. And for our church homes, that's very true. Especially if we've been there for a long time, we're just used to seeing things the way they are, and we don't necessarily see them the way they really are. So one of the things that has happened is that through live streaming, more churches have been exposed to more people. Many churches have gone to live streaming, some more quickly than others, but it's used by almost all churches. It's expanded attendance. There's 5 times more people watching church than on live stream than we're actually going to church, which is really wonderful. It's also attracted new attendees. So right now you're not limited to watching services that are in your community. You can watch services anywhere in the world if you're so inclined. Also, it's made services accessible to people who might have trouble getting to church because of having small children or transportation challenges or whatever the situation might be. So these are some of the great things about the live streaming services, that they have made church available to many more people. And they presented our worship spaces through the lens of 1 or more cameras, because that's the way you have to live stream. And depending upon your church, that is not necessarily a problem. If the view that the camera sees is a pleasant view and it's easy to focus on what the liturgical action, then that's a good thing. But you may have noticed either at your church or other churches that not every church has been set up to look good on camera. So the real question that would raise for you is, what do others see that we may not have seen before? And it doesn't just apply in live streaming. It's true all the time. So is your church, too much going on? Is it distracting, too hard to find the focal point? Is there poor lighting that makes it difficult to see the liturgical action? Is it just very cluttered with lots of things that, again, make it hard to focus on the liturgical action? Or is it just an outdated worship space that really needs updating? And while it may be home to you, it may not be very appealing to others. By the way, I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. These are all the 4 pictures from projects where we did renovations. So these people had already gotten to the point where they realized that they needed to do something. So they were at the beginning and they had many questions, just like some of you might have if you are at the beginning of the process or even thinking about the process of building or renovating a worship space. Some of the questions are, is this the right time to build or renovate? And I don't just mean during a pandemic. There's always that question, is this the right time to build or renovate? How much will it cost? Where will the money come from? Very important questions. How do we involve the parishioners? Or do we involve the parishioners? Where do we start? And most importantly, probably, whom do we trust? Now, if you're looking for answers for the first three questions, I'm sorry, but you're out of luck. That's not what we're going to talk about today. But we are going to talk about involving the parishioners and going through a process to do that. First of all, you want to connect your building project to the church at large. And there are three different ways to do that. One, you can connect to the church in Rome, the Vatican, through the many documents that the Vatican has produced that are relative to liturgy. And here's just a list of some of the more common ones that we might be using to guide. Well, it's certainly the priest and liturgist are using these documents to guide how we do liturgy in the space. And those documents consequently dictate what the space should be like in order to be able to accommodate that. The last set of documents are those put forth by the U.S. Catholic bishops. And the last two under that last item of United States documents are ones that are specifically written to talk about how you design appropriate spaces for Catholic worship. And we're going to talk mostly about the last one, built of living stones. So in addition to connecting your church through the Vatican, through the documents, you also connect to your diocese through the various offices they have there, the worship office, the building and properties office, the financial office, any guidelines that are coming from your bishop. Those are all important to have those kind of connections. And then you involve your parish primarily through the process that you use to go through the design and construction of the church. And the bishops have issued this document, Built of Living Stones. They are guidelines for the architecture and worship in the building and renovating in churches. And this document's been around over 20 years now. It's very, very helpful, very comprehensive. If you look at the table of contents, you'll see that the first chapter is just on what it means to be the living church. And then chapter 2 talks about the church building and the sacred rites that are celebrated there. Chapter 3 is dedicated entirely to art and artists. And then chapter 4, it contains practical information about how to go forward. And although it's called Building a Church, it also applies to renovation. So we're mostly going to focus on that paragraph, but I just wanted to do one or two quotes from the preface. And it explains what this document is for. It's presented to assist the faithful involved in the building or renovation of churches, chapels, and oratories of the Latin Church in the United States. This document is just for the United States. In addition, the document is intended for use by architects, liturgical consultants and artists, contractors, and other professionals engaged in the design and/or construction of these places of worship. So it is a document that can be used by all people involved, parishioners, professionals, everyone. It's a very important and useful document. When this document talks about beginning the process, it talks about how complex a task it is, and that it demands prayer and reflection, technical expertise, and study, which we're going to mention in a minute. To be successful, a building project must be rooted in a proper understanding of the church and of worship that becomes the point of reference for all future decision-making. Let's start with talking about chapter 4, the master plan. What is a master plan? Well, in its simplest terms, it's just a roadmap to take you from one point to the other. And what do you need to know about that? First, you need to know the starting point and the ending point. Let's talk about the ending point first. Let's say you're going to build or renovate a worship space. What are some of the things you want to accomplish in that process? Well, there are a lot of things you would want to accomplish, but I've tried to distill it down to what I feel are the 4 most important things. First of all, the space should be ideally suited to the sacramental life of your particular community. There's a reason that neither Rome nor the local bishops have issued a stock plan for churches that we should all use, is because all faith communities are unique, and the spaces in which they worship should reflect their unique character. That's a very important part. One of the big things relative to liturgy that came out of the Second Vatican Council was the mandate that the worship space fosters full and active participation among the assembly, which is very different than the way things were prior to the Second Vatican Council. So that's a very important element of the design. Obviously, the space needs to be open, accessible, and welcoming to all. That almost goes without saying. And then something that people don't always think about, it's also the place where your parish's mission and/or vision statement can be fostered and fulfilled. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're planning for the newer renovated space. So then if we know what the ending point is, what's the starting point? Well, that's a little bit easier. It's basically where you are now. But the question I ask is, do you have an accurate picture of where you are now? And that leads us to the second part of chapter 4, which is the role of the parish community. Now, it talks about a thing called the assessment of need, and we are going to talk about that. But before we talk about that, we're going to talk about other types of assessments. There are 3 different types of assessments that should probably be done before you start any kind of a building or renovation project. The first is a liturgical assessment, and this would only apply if you're not building a brand new church for a brand new parish where you don't do liturgy at the moment, which is pretty rare. So most churches would benefit from a liturgical assessment. And a facility assessment is only applicable if you do have an existing building. So if you are an existing parish, but you're leaving that building behind and you're building a brand new church, then you don't need to do this. But the needs assessment in terms of the functional needs of the parish, that applies to all projects, and that's what's addressed in Built of Living Stones. Now, the liturgical assessment is typically done by specialists in that, which would be either a liturgist or a liturgical design consultant. These are people who are trained in liturgy, so they would have the best understanding of the documents and the different rituals and so on. And the way that assessment is done is by going to the parish and participating in various liturgies and looking at how things are done. Or in these days, it could be done through observing a live stream video. It's not as good as being there, I'll be honest with you, and it all depends on whether you use one camera or multiple cameras, but you can actually learn quite a bit just from the live streaming if it's done well. And some of the things we're looking at are movement, how do the processional entrance procession and recession work, how does movement work at communion, how do liturgical ministers move throughout the space. These are all things that the liturgical consultant would not be looking at, are they doing it right or are they doing it wrong? They'd be looking at it from the point of view, does the space support good movement and proper movement through the space, or are there obstacles to that? Or perhaps maybe people aren't trained in how to do that. So we'd look at what is the problem there, if there is one. Assembly involvement, how much is the assembly involved? How actively do they participate? If they don't, then what are the sort of drawback? What are the issues that are affecting that? Ritual action, all of the ritual action that takes place during liturgies or sacraments, it's really a question of, can the people involved, are the people involved, can they see it? Can they hear it? Is there space to do it properly? And also proclamation of the word, both spoken and sung. Again, is everything there in place to do that well? So after observing a couple of different liturgies, they would provide you a report that would just kind of look at all those things and could also compare it to your parish mission or vision statement and see if it's consistent with that as well. Facility assessments are typically done by engineers or architects because they're very technical, and it is essentially an evaluation of everything that you currently have, both the site and the building, and every aspect of the building, what we call the envelope, the interior, the systems, ADA compliance, all of those things, basically to identify problems that the facility currently has or that are developing and the solutions to those problems. And they are typically prioritized as either immediate need, short-term need, or long-term need. And then most importantly, they provide you with a range of costs to address all the issues. And this is very useful for long-term planning and project budgeting. particularly, obviously does not apply to a new building, but if you have a building that you are renovating or adding to, you sure want to know if there are other issues that are going to have to be addressed within that time period or shortly thereafter. Otherwise, you wind up, raising the money, doing the renovation, and then 3 years later, you find out, oh, it's going to be $500,000 to update our heating system. Guess we should have thought about that sooner. So it helps you avoid those types of problems. Finally, the needs assessment, or what I call the functional needs assessment, and this is the one addressed in Built of Living Stones. This is usually led by a liturgical design consultant or liturgical architects, people who, again, have experience in liturgy. It usually includes an educational component of some sort, which is why people with specialties in liturgy do it, because it does require some education about liturgy as part of the process. It should involve as many parishioners as possible, and it is done on two scales, one on a sort of specialist scale, working with people who actually work in the parish, and then on a parish level scale, which is what we're going to focus on today. And what comes out of this needs assessment is the basis for future design solutions. So it's extremely important that this be done well, because this is what the designers are going to use in the master plan to design from. So if you miss the mark on the needs, you're going to miss the mark on the design. So this is a very important part of the process. Typically, it starts with just talking about how things are currently being done, what works and what doesn't work, and why doesn't it work. And that usually reveals a number of issues that need to be addressed. Then we ask people to look at what could be done if there were no physical or financial restrictions. And the reason we say that is because a lot of people will not use their imagination to say, well, we could really use this or that. They'll sort of self-censor and say, well, that would be a good thing, but I'm not going to mention it because I don't see how we could possibly do it. And that's really important for people to understand, that they don't need to know how to do it. They just need to identify what they would like to be able to do as a parish. And also to imagine future possibilities. So even things that they are not looking to do right now, but could potentially imagine they might want to do in the future. And the best example I can give you of this is we often talk about, we have over the last 30 years that we've been working with churches, whether they want to incorporate audio video into their church for filming, or there wasn't live streaming originally, but just for, making video recordings of liturgies. And some churches were not ready to do that, but they could imagine that they might want to someday. So they wanted the master plan to include the infrastructure to be able to do that when they were ready. And those churches were either already set up to do live streaming, or were much easier to get set up to do that than those who hadn't thought about that. So these are all things that can be very helpful in the master plan. Now I want to talk a little bit about the master plan process and the steps that we go through on that. As I said, there's the physical needs facility assessment for existing buildings, the functional needs assessment that we just spoke about, then what we call program accommodation alternatives, or basically looking at design options. Then there's a consensus seeking phase where we go to the parish and make sure that this is what they were looking for. And then finally, there's the documentation of that. So I'm not going to go into any detail about the physical needs assessment, because all you really have to do is hire a good professional to do that, and they kind of do it on their own. But the other parts are a little bit more important as to how you do them. So we're going to start with the functional needs assessment. I told you what it is, but now I'm going to tell you why it's important. As it says in Built of Living Stones, in this type of project, a renovation project, parish involvement in the assessment of need and in subsequent planning is especially critical. Although consultation allows opposition to emerge more quickly than it otherwise might, in the final analysis, it is better that all points of view be heard and dealt with in an atmosphere of respect and collaboration than that be left unvoiced to fester for the future. And in almost 30 years of experience, I can't tell you how true that is. One of the very first projects we worked on was a renovation, and there was a lot of fear about one particular component of the church. And that came out in the process that I'm telling you about right now. And it became a very important design criteria, was how to respect that concern of people and not to say, well, sorry, but that's going to change. So we actually came up with a solution that was respectful of that point of view while still meeting the overall needs of the parish. So it is very important. And then those people were very pleased with the end result, even though they were very reluctant in the beginning. So typically when we would do this parish involvement, we would do it in a large assembly. Again, this is pre-COVID, where we would get everybody together for a review of the parish mission statement, which a surprising number of people have never heard before. Depends how well the parish promotes it. But we would review that with people, and then we would give them this visual presentation to expand their thinking, because many times people can only think in the terms of what they've seen, and it is how people learn, is by experience. So we want to make sure that people see more than maybe what they've seen in their own life experience. So we take the issues that are relevant to this parish and we show them how other parishes have dealt with these issues. And we're not recommending these for the parish, we're just saying there's a whole range of solutions for these problems, and we want to show you some of them. And I'm going to show you some of those in a little bit. We then break them down into small discussion groups of about 10 people. We give them a list of questions which are relative to how they feel about various aspects of the church. And we have a facilitator for that group and a recorder, and the recorder writes down everything that's said. We use a mutual invitation process for sharing so that everybody has a chance to share. And then the moderator makes sure that people are focused on the needs, not the solutions. So if somebody says something like, I think we need more stained glass windows in the church, the moderator would ask, well, what's the need behind that? Why do you think we need them? And there could be a number of reasons why they think they need them. But when you ask the question, they'll say something like, well, I just think it'll make it look like more like a Catholic church. Then that's the need from this person's point of view, that it should look more like a Catholic church, and that's what that would get documented. So the recorders put it all together into a brief summary, about a 3-minute summary, and then they get up in front of, they would gather everybody back together, and they all get up together, and the recorders present what their group came up with. And about halfway through the process, you find there's an awful lot of repetition, which is a good thing, because what that shows is, though, even though everybody had all these independent discussion groups, they all pretty much came up with the same ideas. Obviously, there's some unique things, but the things that people have the most consensus on really emerged from this process. So that helps the designers understand what's most important to the people in the parish. Then the recorders document all of these comments, send it into the people doing the master plan, and then that group prepares this needs assessment report, which basically summarizes everything that happened in this meeting. Now, we started a project in March, a new church design, and we needed to do the process a little bit differently. So this time we gathered everybody together by the way of a platform called GoToWebinar, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And we did it in 2 sessions because we were limited to 250 people per session, and we knew more than that wanted to participate. In fact, 400 people participated. Normally a church that size, we would get 100, but we got 400 because it was online and because people were locked down and didn't have anything else to do. So we started out with the same thing, the review of the parish mission statement, the presentation to expand the thinking. Then we talked about how we were going to do this, the description of the information gathering process, and we took questions and answers about the process. And the process was to do this through an online survey for everyone who participated in this event, which was automatically launched as soon as they logged out. So they could do it later if they wanted to, but the idea was you had to attend the workshop in order to be able to participate in the survey, because we feel that's kind of a package deal. And of course, we recorded the entire event so that if you did want to see it again, you could go back and watch it again. And then same thing at the end of the process, we come up with a report. I want to just show you, I'll talk a little bit about the survey, because normally when we have the small group discussions, we just ask open-ended questions such as, how welcoming do you think our worship space is? Well, we wanted to limit the open-ended questions because it's hard to gather data from 400 people if they're all open-ended questions. So we made it more data friendly, if you will. So we broke the question into 3 parts. 1, using a scale where 0 means unwelcoming and 10 means extremely welcoming. How would you rate our previous church on being welcoming to all peoples in all places? And you'll see later that this has to do with their mission statement. And then some questions were multiple choice, like this one. Do you think visitors felt the same way? The options were yes, no, or not sure. And then we always gave people a chance to write freely about what they felt impacted the design. In this case, what do you feel the building, how do you feel the building design impacted that feeling, either positively or negatively? And all of the questions, there were, if you count this as 3 questions, the survey had a total of 20 questions. There was a lot of collating to do. In the report, it's usually broken down into topics on worship and music ministry, hospitality ministry, other ministries, and then there's a 1 or 2 page summary that kind of really lists the high points of what is the consensus among the parish, what are the most important needs. And you notice that there's an appendix called parishioner input, and that is where we put in the results from the survey. And you're seeing the beginning of that page now. So you can see for that first question, the rating was 6.7. That's okay. It's not great, but 6.7 out of 10 for how welcoming it is. Could be better. 62% felt that it was welcoming, and the other ones weren't sure. And then people had a chance to give very specific feedback, and we categorized it all to make it easier to digest. So if we put it under positively, we said, you know, is it under the general design, which things do you think helped? The exterior, the interior, all sorts of things. And then we would do the negative things and so on and so forth. And when we were collating this, everyone's comment got recorded, but comments that were similar got recorded in sequence. So that as you read through it, if you, for instance, one of the questions on the positive interior design was the circular seating of the space. And there were like 63 people who listed that as no, it was more than that. They listed it as the most important aspect of the sense of community. So actually, I think it was 63%, not 63. So really, we got a very strong reading about what people wanted in terms of an interior seating design, because this was really important to them. So very effective in giving direction to the design team. So I've done a lot of talking and showed you a lot of words, but usually when you talk about design, we want to see some images. But what I thought I would do is to show you, give you an example of that mind-expanding presentation, the one we did for this parish. I will show as much of it as we have time to within our hour, and then I'll just cut back to the presentation so that we stay within the time frame. So going back over the first sentence, Most Blessed Sacrament Parish is a welcoming community which comes together to implement Christ's mission. So one of our jobs is to try to reflect in the design of the building certain theologies or philosophies that you have as a parish. And as being a welcoming community is part of your mission statement, the first set of images is going to focus on how can that be expressed architecturally. There are a lot of different ways it can be expressed, and I'm just going to show you some examples, and certainly not limited to the ones I'm showing you now. But the way that what I call an entry plaza often makes that first statement as people are driving up to the church. What do they see? Do they see any barriers to access if they're disabled? Do they see open spaces where they can meet with other people? This photograph was taken shortly after the building was finished, but by now there are mature trees and there's shade and there's inviting things. So there's the way that what's set in front of the building helps to say whether the building is welcome. In this image, you can see the people gathering because it's nice weather. They're gathering outside, but they would also have the opportunity to do so under a covered area if that was necessary. Another way to welcome people in is through transparency in the building. A lot of times for people who don't go to church regularly or never been to church, they are they're a little bit nervous about going in because they don't know what's going on inside. So one of the ways that churches become more welcoming is to have a certain level of transparency where people can actually see what's going on inside the building. So in this image, you see the doors open as well as glass surrounding that. So this is a very inviting entry for people to come into. The doors themselves can be something that either encourages people to interact with them or not. So actually, it's an interesting photograph because you can see on the right and left of this door, kind of standard commercial aluminum door. That's not much more inviting than, say, a door to a store. But if you look at the doors to the main ceremonial doors, they're certainly more interesting and perhaps more welcoming. The doors inside the church are also another opportunity to say something about who you are. And this particular parish, which is in Allendale, wanted to make sure that they conveyed their mission and their who they are as a parish, which is the Church of the Guardian Angel. So they had these doors made with carved guardian angels on. And another church in Demorest took a different motif, sort of the tree of life motif, as a way of welcoming people into the worship space. Once we get through the doors of the church, though, we have another opportunity to welcome people with a gathering space. And these have become a lot more popular over the years. Many churches have added these when new churches are often built with them. And this is a great place for greeting people and for people to gather either before or after the worship service. Sometimes there's food provided, but these spaces are very important. And they don't have to be just one use as well. This particular church, in the floor of the gathering space, there is a replica of the Chartres Labyrinth. So they can use this space as a prayer space as well for people to come in and walk the labyrinth indoors, which is a very nice opportunity. Artwork can also be a way of welcoming people. At this parish in Montville, this statue of the Holy Family, which was created for this parish, certainly sends the message that families with children are welcome. That's a very reassuring thing if you have young children, to know that that's an important value for this church. And there are a lot of ways to communicate with artwork what you want to say to people. Natural elements can also do that for people, particularly when you live in areas like New Jersey where there's a long winter. If you're able to come inside to a garden-like space, that can be a beautiful, welcoming, inviting way to come into a space. And you see that in this entry to a chapel in upstate New York. And then finally, in that gathering space, we can do more than just have a space for meeting and greeting. It can become a space for fellowship, where people can have coffee or donuts or other baked goods or whatever you want to serve for them. And you can see in this image as well that there are a variety of ways for people to gather. You can sit on couches or chairs or at bars or at round tables. So there are a lot of things that we can do as people come into the space to make them feel welcome. And there'll be a question about that on the survey. So let's go back to the mission statement and look at the second sentence. We join to teach, to evangelize, to accept, and to encourage ourselves and others in ongoing spiritual growth. Well, it's pretty hard to exemplify spiritual growth in the building because spiritual growth really comes from personal growth fostered by others. But the building, like any building, can either support that or work against that. And I feel that if we create a spiritual environment, then we create a place where spiritual growth is a little bit easier to happen. So the next set of images are images of spaces that may or may not, in your opinion, have a spiritual quality to it. And this is where some of your work starts, is if you look at these images, and some of them will appeal to you and some of them won't. The ones that appeal to you, or the ones that speak to you, or the ones that convey spiritual space to you, try to take note when you're looking at it, maybe about what makes it feel that way. Is it the scale? Is it the light? Is it the natural light? Is it the materials? So as you look at these, think about which things speak to you and why, because those will be important questions for us to hear from you. So we're all familiar with
more traditional older spaces, and there was always a very strong philosophy about how to make spaces spiritual, which was to make them tall and reaching toward God, and lots of stained glass windows. And many people find these spaces spiritual. Some people don't. So it's not the same thing for everyone, and there is no right or wrong answer. The question is, well, what's it say to you? The same kinds of forms and light can also be done in contemporary buildings, where some of the same geometries and things are used to bring in natural light in different ways. So it's not limited to traditional styles. Electric light can also be used very effectively to create a sense of spirituality. In this building, you see that there's very little natural light because of just some small stained glass windows, but the electric lighting has been done in a way to create sort of a sense of spirituality in the space. Whereas in other spaces, it's just a brightness. It's all filling the space with light. So there are different approaches, and not everything is good for everybody. But again, one of the things you see in this one, which you saw in the last one, is the seating is, in this case, sort of fan shaped. Is that part of it? Is that part of what makes us feel spiritual? Is the way people sit in the space? I don't know. Answer the question. The placement of the altar and the design of the altar, obviously in Catholic churches, is a very important part of what gives the space its character. So again, I'm just showing you a few examples. This was a renovation of a historic church, and you can see the placement of the altar and the ambo. And these are more contemporary churches where you also see that the altar does not have to be square or rectangular. In these cases, it's octagonal, and the one on the right is actually a softened triangle. So lots of different ways to create spiritual spaces. Any space that's sacramental would ideally be spiritual as well. And you can see that in this space, the baptismal font is actually in its own space to give it its own real character of meditative space. So it's actually a separate baptistry that you pass through on the way to the church. And there's artwork and there's lighting, there's places so that we can actually reflect on the importance of baptism in our life. Whereas in this church, there's a very large baptismal pool right in the middle of the church, so that the parish can really be involved in the baptisms that take place, and adults can actually be laid down in that baptismal font for baptism, while infants can be baptized in the upper font. So it's another approach. And in this example, this is out in the gathering space, so it's not in the room, but it's visible to the church. And this also is a step-down font where the portion you can't see in the photograph is the place where adults can be baptized. These are all different ways to communicate the importance of the sacrament of baptism. And then there are also private prayer spaces and devotional spaces, and spaces like reservation chapels. So here you see a very simple wooden tabernacle on the left with the prie-dieu on the right. And again, places for reservation or for prayer can be traditional, they can be contemporary, they can be large, they can be small. It's a real question of what do you need as a parish? And they can be very contemporary, as you see in these examples from the West Coast, of very modern spaces. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that this is just to show you a variety of options. At this point, we have no idea what will be the final design for your church. And then returning to the mission statement one more time, in the last sentence, it says, serving and supporting those within and beyond our parish remains a major focus as we recognize that each of us is called to be a witness to God's love. Now, it is very possible for a building to be a witness, and there are a lot of ways to do that, some that you may be familiar with and some that you aren't. But as this sentence also talks about supporting those within and beyond our parish, I think it is important for your building to bear witness to who you are as a parish and as a church, and what you want to express to the community. So we'll just look at a couple of examples. Probably the best known way for churches to witness, one of the best known ways, is through a steeple. Churches have had steeples for many, many years, and very traditional churches usually often have very tall steeples, but contemporary churches can also have tall steeples. This steeple is about 120 feet tall. Church sits on a corner of a highway and another street, and they wanted everybody to know that there was a church there. So that was how they communicated that. The churches have erected very large crosses, even near their building or on their property, as a way of proclaiming their Christian faith, and again, letting people know that this is a Christian church. And of course, a very traditional way is through bells and carillons, which you had in your church, and the bell tower, as I said, is still standing at the moment. We don't really know whether that's going to stay or not. Kind of depends on how people feel about it, but that is another way of witnessing to the community. But some of the ways you might not have thought about yet are one of these is this idea of transparency. As I mentioned before, a lot of times people don't know what goes on in churches if they've never been to a church. And if you have a building that's pretty transparent, as this one is, then it gives people a chance to kind of see what's going on and get an idea of what the church looks like, literally. And when I say church, I mean the people. So you can make your building more transparent to allow people to see what's going on inside as a way of witnessing. Conversely, you can use the building more or less as a place to project out the light that comes from within. So in this church in Demorest, the building lighting on the inside allows people from the outside to see the stained glass windows and to see the warm glow coming from inside the church. So it kind of does the opposite. It doesn't let people see in, but it communicates outwardly what the church is about. So you can see there are a lot of ways to do this. Another way to think about is once you have people inside the church, another way to witness to who you are is to open your doors to the community for things like community events. So concerts or plays or lectures or other things that you might want the community to be able to use either your worship space or other spaces in your building for. And those are good ways of witnessing to the community about your values. And finally, the other one I want to mention is what I call caregiving. You may have, I know that you support a thrift shop. People like to, some churches are very strongly support food pantries, but instead of just collecting food and donating it to a food pantry elsewhere, this church not only has their own food pantry, but they keep it right there near the entrance to the church, because they want to send the message to people that this is an important part of our ministry, and it's not something that we want the people who use it to have to go around the back to pick up their food. We want them to be welcome into our church to, meet, to see us and for us to see them if they want. That's a possibility, and there are different ways to handle that. But at the very least, it sends a message to any visitor that feeding the hungry is important to this parish.
Once again, that was a recording from a parish-wide presentation done in, I believe, March or April of this year for the parish of Most Blessed Sacrament in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey. So all the references to the churches were all of the churches in New Jersey. And I hope you found that interesting. So once that process is over and the report has been written, then it's time to develop the design alternatives. And again, it used to be done this way, with design meetings of the committee happening in the architect's office or the church's office. And now it's simply done this way over some kind of virtual meeting platform, which in many respects works just as well, if not better. It certainly works better if people have trouble getting together physically, and up in the Northeast, meetings never have to be canceled because of snow. So the process is pretty much the same. And then the same thing with the design. Design presentations were done through the same platform. It gives everybody a chance to actually see what's being presented, because they have it right on the screen in front of them. We also provide handouts to the committee members so that they have hard copies of everything that gets emailed to them before the presentation. And one of the nice things about using these virtual platforms is that you can set them up to record the meetings and also to provide transcripts, so that you actually have a written and recorded document of everything that was discussed. And that can be very useful for the person doing the notes, which was typically me. So that's a nice feature of using the platforms. So let's say we get through that process, and that's sometimes a long process. I think in this particular parish, it took about 8 or 10 meetings to get to a plan that the parish felt was, or the committee felt was ready to be presented to the parish. So then it's time to see if the parish agrees with the work of the committee, which is consensus seeking. And again, typically it would have been done in a presentation like this, and now it's done in a presentation like this, where we basically just have a webinar and have everybody sign up. So that's what we've been doing. That presentation usually consists of welcoming prayer. We have a brief presentation by the committee member about the process. And then this is important. We review, because it's been now, 6 months since we did the needs assessment report. So we go back and we review that with everyone at the presentation. We just review the highlights. So like in this particular case, there were 7 needs that were identified. So we just list them. These are the 7 needs that you folks identified back in March or April. And then we'll walk them through the design. Both the design consultant and the architect will walk them through. And again, as we're doing that, we talk about how it meets their needs. So if you look at this next slide, you remember that I told you that one of the needs that came out very strongly was the need to maintain the circular seating arrangement that they had. So obviously, we will talk about that aspect of the design. We'll talk about liturgically why the altar is in alignment with the baptismal font. We'll talk about why the tabernacle is here. Always trying to tie, one of the needs they said is they wanted a more prominent location for the tabernacle, which used to be off in a side chapel, and now it's going to be front and center. So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure we let them know that we've heard them and we've addressed these things in the design. Then, of course, we talk about the project budget funding, and then we take a break and we give people a chance to, again, they have handouts that they can download from the platform. We give them a chance to think of questions, and then we group those questions to make the process efficient. And then in the live portion of this process, we answer all those questions, as many as we can. And then one of the nice things we can do, we used to do this by handing out cards at the end and then collecting them. And then after everybody went home, we would tally them up. But now, as you know, there are polls that can be done within the context of the platform, which give you immediate results. So now we can get, and everybody else can see the feedback. So we ask a 2-question poll at the end of the presentation. And the first question is, do you feel that the proposed design reflects the mission of the parish? So you'll recall that we have been focusing on the mission of the parish throughout this whole process. So why not use that as the measuring stick about whether we actually are on the mark? Does it reflect the mission of the parish? And people have 5 options to answer. And then the second question, we always tell people that the master plan is not a final drawing. It's not a final design. It's just a direction that we want to move forward in. So we ask them, do you feel you can support the general direction for the project that was presented this evening? And by support, we don't necessarily mean my financial, although that's part of it. But basically to say, if someone said to you, what do you think of what was presented today? You could say, yeah, I think that was a good solution. And then again, we give the people a chance to answer, and then we get our results and we can share those with everybody. And then that wraps up the meeting. And of course, the last step is the documentation of it, which again, the team putting this together will put together some kind of a master plan report. And it'll be just like the presentation. It'll include an introduction, a summary of the building needs assessment. It will have a narrative description of the design that was just presented to everybody. So it'll talk specifically about the worship space, spaces for fellowship and outreach, children's ministry, and so on, all the way down the line for every area of the parish. And then it will talk about the project costs and how it's going to be phased. It will include drawings of everything that was presented. And then most importantly, and this is why this comes after the parish meeting, it includes comments and responses from the master plan presentation. So this way, again, everybody's voice is heard. So if people liked or didn't like things, we put that all in the report. And if there were things that were significant that people didn't like, then before the project moves forward, the master plan could be revised. So it's not always over at this point. It may need some more revisions. That's the purpose of the parish meeting. So that's the master plan process. It's a lot of work for everybody involved, but it's typically headed by professionals. And Built of Living Stones, as I said before, addresses the role of professionals. And it talks about the architect being the one who basically is responsible for all of the consultants. So if you hire an architect, and an architect, by the way, has to do the design portion of the master plan, either a liturgical architect or a non-liturgical architect working with a liturgical consultant. But most states require an architect. If there's any design involved, an architect is required. But that architect, as the project moves forward, would hire all the consultants that are necessary. It also talks about the essential nature of collaboration, and that in this particular case, collaboration that reflects the very nature of the body of Christ, and this is very true. The members of the parish community, along with their pastor, the liturgical consultant, the artist, the architect, the contractor, are all called to a collaborative effort, whose goal is to summon forth the finest expressions of faith within their means. When you are choosing professionals for this project, whether it's a liturgical consultant, architect, or a contractor, it is very, very important to choose people who believe in the collaborative process. There are some people who do and some people who don't. There are architects called starchitects who basically like to run the show, and they're not really into collaboration because that's not how they work. And they do some fine work, but designing a church is typically not the place for that type of an architect. You really want everyone to work together and everyone to contribute to the process, because the result is much better from the contributions of all the people involved. In the last part, we're going to talk about our roles within the parish. Actually, outside the parish, or part of the parish, is the bishop, who in his role of fostering and governing the liturgy must assume primary responsibility and authority for the regulation and direction of such projects. So I don't know of any diocese where you can build or renovate a Catholic church without the approval of the bishop. So it's a good idea to work closely with the bishop throughout the whole process to make sure that you get the bishop's approval or his office's approval before the project can go to construction. In the final analysis, decisions concerning every facet of the building program from beginning to end remain with the pastor. Obviously, the pastor has the authority to make those decisions. Different pastors take different positions. Some pastors like to leave most of the power, if you will, with the building committee and really only get involved when it's talking about liturgical aspects. And other pastors want to be involved in every single issue. Either way is fine. It's just as long as there's good communication between all the members. And the role of the parish building committee is to assist with the development of realistic plans based on their experience, and also to provide an ongoing objective evaluation of the work as it progresses. So it's very important to have a building committee that understands not just building and design, but understands the parish's needs, how the parish works, so then when they can evaluate the designs, they're looking at it from the point of view, just like you would for your own home. Well, this isn't how my family does things, so this plan wouldn't work for me. Same thing with a church. This is how we do things, so it's got to be designed for the way we do things. My last question is, where do you start with this process? With whom do you start? Do you start something in-house? Some people will tell you first thing you need is a fundraising consultant so you know how much money you have to deal with. Or do you hire a liturgical design consultant, or a liturgical architect, or a local architect, or a design build company? Now, all these people can be part of the process, but the question is, which one do you start with? And again, going back to Built of Living Stones, it very specifically says when the parish begins to undertake the building or renovating of a liturgical space, the parish building committee should obtain the services of specialists in liturgical design. And it goes on to list really only two specialists in liturgical design, that is liturgical architects and liturgical consultants. And these are people who have the experience in liturgy and art and so on to be able to really help this process along. And I can tell you, I know some people who have hired great architects who had no liturgical experience, and they did not hire a liturgical consultant. And they spent the better part of every meeting educating the architect on how liturgy works in general and specifically in their parish. So you can hire people without that experience, but you're going to then take on the role of having to educate that person in liturgical design if you want the building designed properly. Just something to keep in mind. Now, before I wrap up, I just wanted to say there's a few things that the pandemic has taught us in this process. One is, and this is relative to the selection of professionals, there's no need to limit your selection of liturgical design consultants, architects, or artists to those within a certain distance from your church, because we've all learned that we don't all need to be in the same room to work together. And as I mentioned, the project we started in New Jersey in April, we never met again after the interview, except online. The architect, I as the liturgical consultant, and the committee and the diocese, all meetings were done virtually. And we had a great presentation to the parish, also done virtually. So it really doesn't matter where people are. You really can just do this way. And there are some benefits to it, as I mentioned before. One of them being we've seen much greater parishioner involvement by holding parish meetings online than we ever saw with in-person meetings. So that's one of the things that we have learned from this. But with or without a pandemic, a successful project yields a place of worship that supports the liturgical life of a faith community and reflects the beauty of God. Let me just read that one more time. A successful project, whether it's a renovation or new construction, yields a place of worship that supports the liturgical life of a faith community and reflects the beauty of God. And a successful project encourages the growth in the spiritual life of a faith community. And that is really what the process is about, because at the end of the day, every church built for the people of God unfolds Christ's presence. And that is the work that we are about. We're not just building buildings. We're not just renovating. We are unfolding Christ's presence to everyone who is a part of and will be in that space that we work on. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I just put up briefly my contact information if you're interested in getting in touch with me. We have a blog that you can find at jameshunt.com/WP. And that is gets lots of information in there. There's samples of master plans and other things that you can get from there that I would recommend you check out if you're interested in more information. Or you can email me at that address, or call me directly on my cell phone, or text me at the number listed there. And also want to mention that I, as part of the ACLS group, there's also the website where you can find out more about ACLS. And if you are looking for liturgical design consultants, liturgical architects, or artists, that is a wonderful place to start your search. You can search by geographic area, which is less important than searching by what is it that you're looking for them to provide. And then you can look at samples in their portfolio, the types of projects that they've done. There's contact information. So it's a wonderful resource for when I talk about where to start there. And again, there's other information about the process, and we'll soon be making some of our webinars available through YouTube, which will also be more opportunities for you to learn. So look for that as well. I believe it's now time for the question and answer session, and apparently you can join that live by going to your agenda and selecting the Looking at Your Worship Space Q&A. And then I will join you in person to answer any questions. I look forward to that. Thank you.